Good evening, good morning, or good afternoon, depending on when you're watching this presentation. My presentation is entitled From Scientific Ethnography to Indigenous Critical Auto-Ethnography. I want to talk about making qualitative research a science, the origins of ethnography, making ethnography itself a science, and then in the 1970s and 80s, a colonial turn, a shift, a crisis in qualitative and ethnographic research, enter auto-ethnography, and then one of the developments in auto-ethnography, which is an Indigenous critical auto-ethnography. So let's begin with qualitative research as a science. The tension for all qualitative studies is between science and art. Two strands of history are useful here. That of Glasser and Strauss's grounded theory, and that of Malinowski's discovery of ethnography as science. Most of you are familiar with the rationale behind grounded theory, the attempts by Glasser and Strauss to construct a rigorous science within qualitative methods, and published in their discovery of grounded theory in 1967. Glasser and Strauss's original position was that grounded theory was an objective method of research, rigorous science. We know that there are later developments in grounded theory around this very question of whether it was an objective or subjective endeavour. The key sociologist in the 21st century in grounded theory, of course, is Kathy Sharmas, who took grounded theory to the next step of constructivist grounded theory. She's influenced by the changes in qualitative research, in the developments of symbolic interactionism, feminist theory, and critical theory. So Sharmas defines constructivist grounded theory as social scientific perspective that addresses how realities are made. This perspective assumes that people construct their realities, the realities in which they participate. Hence, she takes a relativist position. And this will be important for our exploration of auto-ethnography. Sharmas argues that it's not just your participants who socially construct their world, but you too, as the researcher, socially construct the world. So, what are the origins of ethnography itself? According to Fabian, anthropology as the discipline and ethnography as the method have their origins in the shift from human salvation achieved through the reenactment of the Christian journey to real travels to real foreign places in order to deepen one's own humanness through knowledge and understanding of the other, the exotic other. So we get with ethnography or with anthropology the construction of the exotic other, and that's very important for later developments in Indigenous auto-ethnography. So Fabian is suggesting that in the early colonial period, say from the 16th to the 18th century, that this is the precursor for the disciplines of anthropology, the travels that mainly young men from Europe did to the New World. So where the medieval and Western Christian notion of history saw non-Christians as pagans to be converted and brought into the fold, the secular notion of history that arises from the Enlightenment positions the savage as needing to be civilised. Now, Fabian suggests that part of this construction is an evolutionary ethnography, that there are binary differences between the Western world of knowledge and the colonised world. So these binary differences, of course, have a hierarchy. So for the Western world, it's urban versus the colonised world as rural, male versus female, industrial versus feudal, developed versus developing, first world, third world, Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, so community versus the anonymity of the urban world, charisma versus routine. So this is a kind of hierarchy that underpins this evolutionary ethnography. So how then does ethnography move to become a science? The father of the ethnographic methods, or the founder of ethnographic methods, is attributed to a Polish social scientist, Malinowski. Of course, we know that this is an overstatement, that other anthropologists at the time, particularly within the British tradition, were fairly transparent about their methods. But in order to, as it were, begin a history of establishing ethnography as a science, we turn to the kind of techniques that Malinowski introduced into ethnography. Roldan attributes 6 distinctive differences in the work that Malinowski introduced into his ethnographic research, and these now constitute key aspects of ethnography. They are living for a long time among the people he wished to study, limiting the research to specific topics, focusing on the people in the present, not the past, learning the language, increasing and focusing on observation of the exotic other, the native, in his or her own context and institutions, and changing the way in which you reported on that culture. In his earlier studies, Malinowski gathered data by talking to non-native informers. The joke is that he sat on the missionary or white settlers' veranda and listened to their renditions of who the natives were. However, he later begins to settle in the village, to set up camp in the village, assisted now by an informer from within the group. It's presumed that the motivation for doing so was because he was a Polish citizen during World War I here in Australia, and when he went to the various islands, he wasn't welcome on the missionary's veranda. So in a sense, he had to go and live amongst the people. Whatever the motivation, he begins to realise that the data he's getting is more authentic. In his later studies, he realises he needs to learn the language to understand the thinking of those he's studying. So he knows that language is not simply a translation of one word to another language, from Aranda to English or Polish in his case. In order to understand a culture, you need to know the thinking behind how the people express the concept. Secondly, Malinowski differs from anthropologists who go before him, who sought to understand cultures in their entirety. So he just focuses on one or two aspects. He's interested in religion, he's interested in magic within these cultures, and what kind of functional role it plays. He's not an armchair anthropologist. He wants to, as it were, theorise, but theorise from what is present. Thirdly, he focuses on the people where they are now, not on their past. So he's not looking for traditional culture, what they were pre-contact, but he's looking at who are they now. Importantly, at number 5, he increases his observations and puts himself in situations where he can maximise these observations in the village, in the camp, or for our own research, say, in the ward, in the classroom, on Facebook, wherever it is you're doing your observations. Now, it's a fairly important component of ethnography. Participant or non-participant observation distinguishes ethnography from other methodologies or methods. The 6th point is that he writes his accounts of culture, and when he writes them, he reports on his methods. He tells the reader how he gathered the data and how it is that in the gathering of the data, he generated a particular theoretical explanation of what's happening. So his publications are not field notes, but carefully analysed and ordered accounts of what is happening, shaped by his theoretical thinking. The important point raised by Rodin is that Malinowski sought to make ethnography a science. Finally, Malinowski argues that scientific ethnography is composed of method, so it's the field work, a theory, and an object, and the object is the exotic other or primitive man, or however they refer to them. The theory is functionalist. A trained anthropologist spends time observing a primitive society and produces an objective report. This is the definition, as it were, of ethnography. So what is classic ethnography? It's a long stint in the field, 2 to 3 years, broken into 2 parts. There's a period out of the field to prevent yourself from going native. Now, politically incorrect as that term is, it's worth remembering it because when we move to auto-ethnography, one is the native. Thirdly, strong participant observation, and this is linked to this notion of the self is the data gathering tool. You learn the language of the other culture. You write up the account as a narrative in an objective way, right? So the argument is that it's an objective account, although the self is the tool that's gathering the data. So you can see there's a bit of a contradiction there. So what happens to classical ethnography? There is, in a sense, a colonial turn, a challenge to ethnography, and from it, the birth of auto-ethnography and other forms of qualitative research in this century and in the latter part of the last century. I want to just pick up on some of the colonial turns. So I'm drawing here on Haneo and other authors. Haneo argues that by the mid-20th century, it's no longer possible to do studies on small-scale tribal groups for 2 reasons. Firstly, the people belonging to these tribal groups in colonised countries had moved to urban areas and become part of global capitalist economies. They're no longer isolated from Western capitalism, so it's no longer possible to study them in some sort of isolated situation. The second major influence is the democratisation of education, with an increased number of students wanting to study anthropology and do ethnography. So there are a number of trends that emerge out of this. The first is it becomes politically difficult to study the colonised other post-war. Funding for these large-scale studies dries up, and so there's a shift to studying one's own culture, and so you get the generation of the subdiscipline of anthropology, urban anthropology. More importantly, the colonised people themselves had become educated, at least the elite, and many of them wanted to study their own culture. So they're the ones that are doing the study of their own culture. Now, for Hanio, he suggests that if you're studying your own culture, you're doing auto-ethnography. Now, I would argue that the definition of auto-ethnography is much more intricate or extensive than that definition. Now, Hughes and Pennington extend Hanio's account of the contribution of the Chicago School to note that, say, between the two world wars, Robert Park, who was an academic in the Chicago University in the sociology department, encourages his students to study topics that they're familiar with. So it's a kind of urban sociology, I guess. But these students aren't doing auto-ethnography. They might tell you in a footnote in the preface that they used to drive a taxi or they were in the military, and that's why they're doing this study. Post-Second World War, many of the ethnographic studies done by the sociology students are about aspects of their own lives. Once again, homeless people, cab drivers, etc. But it's only in the methodology section do people begin to tell you that they were familiar with this world because they were in it themselves at one stage. They might put something in the methodology. Now, these days we would address this through a positionality statement or a standpoint statement. Hanio continues to refer to this as auto-ethnography, but of course he's writing in the 1970s. A further trend is the rise in emancipation movements post-war, whereby it becomes increasingly difficult to refer to colonised people in terms of the exotic other. By the 1970s, the anthropologists began to question their portrayal of the other, right? And the responsibility that they had at a political level to tread carefully in how they represented and presented their accounts of people, as the political fallout could be dire. A further influence is, of course, the crisis in objectivity for qualitative research, of which ethnography gets caught up in. So Hughes and Pennington note that there's a crisis in qualitative research known as the fourth movement. This is a crisis in challenging the objectivity of, say, science as an ethnography, ethnography as a science, or grounded theory as a science. On the one hand, qualitative research is pitted against positivism, and on the other, it's pitted against post-positivism. Much of this crisis arises from the challenging idea that a written text could convey the truth of the lived experience. So there's a challenge to that idea. And so there's this notion that we need new ways of shaping the text based on the lived experience, right? So where previously it had been taboo to insert yourself into the text, there's now this challenge to objectivity. It doesn't matter whether you insert yourself or not. You can't be objective. It's all subjective. And today we would probably take the position of saying even positivist research has some form of subjectivity in it. Now, closely aligned to these critiques and incidents is the alignment of anthropology with the colonial administrations. So Grimshaw and Hart argue that post-World War II, ethnography championed theory, so the anthropologist was doing studies of particular colonised or post-colonised people, and they're theorising about them rather than talking about their real social lives. So they're talking about their institutions and how they function rather than what the people are really doing. So this enables anthropology and their ethnography to be used by the welfare state, which wishes to control these either colonised, former colonised or post-colonised people. So the dilemma for the anthropologist is that when they come to do their ethnography, they think that they're going to confront a primitive person, but they're not. They're confronting a boisterous native population seeking independence, while the state, who may have employed them, wishes to contain this population through a process of welfare dependence. So let's have a look at a case study that kind of epitomises much of this. And it epitomises it by throwing up the notion that maybe anthropology and their ethnographic findings are a hoax. The best example of this is Derek Freeman's attack on Margaret Mead, her book Coming of Age in Samoa, which she published in 1928. So Derek Freeman is an anthropologist at the Australian National University in the 1980s. In Mead's account of Samoan female adolescence, she argued that the stress of navigating adolescence was not experienced by Samoan teenagers because, unlike their American counterparts, the Western notion of choice was not a strong cultural feature in Samoa, even of those who had become Christian and were already living in boarding schools. So a key component of Mead's argument was that while adolescence is biologically shared across the world, the stress that adolescents experience is a cultural construction. Now, a minor point of her argument was that there were fewer taboos about sexual practice among Samoan adolescents than there were in America. Freeman, as it were, clutches onto this. He'd done fieldwork himself in Samoa. He argued that the girls, the young women, who were now, of course, old women, that Mead had interviewed, had actually duped her, that they joked about their sexual exploits, leading Mead to see that Samoan culture was, as it were, sexually permissive. The important point in defence of Mead is that her thesis was not about sexual practices. It's about the choice and adolescent stress. However, this incident in the 1980s is taken up by the academic community and by the popular press, and it begins to discredit ethnography. Now, it goes beyond that. The response from Samoan academics raised serious questions about ethnographic work. For example, Chief Isaiah, an academic in Samoa, publishes a book, Coming of Age in Anthropology, Margaret Mead and Paradise. He publishes this in 1999. He threatens to take Mead to court over her publication. He ordered the removal of all her publications on Samoa, arguing that the data was a form of sequestering his intellectual property, and he threatened legal action because of the loss of tourist income. The scene is now set for knowledge of Indigenous groups to be owned by them and not by the outside ethnographer. So as a consequence of these various forces, by the 1980s, ethnography and anthropology come to a crisis about scientific ethnography, or for that matter, all qualitative studies, spurred by postmodernism, with its rejection of universal truths and the impossibility of writing about the other. So enter, as it were, other forms of doing ethnography or other forms of presenting the truth. So as I said, Haneo defines auto-ethnography as having full membership within a particular cultural group, and it's where the ethnographer writes about their own culture. This definition is too limited for proponents of auto-ethnography because it's also possible to write about interactions with others at the margins. But let's say that auto-ethnography is ethnography plus autobiography. It's the story about yourself. It can be either an evocative portrayal of the self, capturing the situation, or an analytical interpretation. So if we say that ethnography used the self as a tool through participant observation, in auto-ethnography, both participant observation, the self as the tool, and the self as the topic is how it is constructed. So the self is both the tool and the topic. We want to have a look at some of the characteristics or steps in auto-ethnography. One of the best ways is to look at Anderson's analytical auto-ethnography. He argues that to do an auto-ethnography, one must be part of the research, must be a participant observer. Your portrayal must be analytical and reflective. It's not a novel. You must reflect on your story. You must be visible in the findings, in the results, in the story. You must dialogue with other participants, which of course is difficult. And in a sense, you must theorise around the particular events. So it's a bit more than what Haneo says. It's not about writing about your own culture. It is writing about yourself. So auto-ethnography provides an ethnographic other, the exotic other, now with a clear voice for portraying their post-colonial voice. If we want to look at auto-ethnography from the Indigenous point of view, a simple Google search will give us something like 25,000 hits. But let me just talk about one particular one. One of the streams within auto-ethnography is Indigenous auto-ethnography, critical Indigenous auto-ethnography. So now we have the exotic other, the native person, now defining themselves and not being defined. So the insider now begins to talk about themselves in relation to society and how the kind of post-colonial politics impact on who they are. The example I've taken is Michelle Bishop, who's an Australian Indigenous academic. She argues that the shift from ethnography to auto-ethnography allowed for the development of an Indigenous post-colonial approach to critical studies on colonisation, but also to the generation of Indigenous knowledge. She's not alone in this. I've just listed several other Australian auto-ethnographers, Indigenous auto-ethnographers, scholars. What she does argue is that for the Indigenous auto-ethnography, it moves the I or the auto to group, kin and community. So I think what she means there that much of the knowledge is checked out with the others, with others in the group. That the notion of objectivity is of course not there because it's swamped by relationships. So it's very subjective and its truth claim is based on one's relationships with the group. McIver argues that if one is writing an Indigenous auto-ethnography, one must talk about one's spirituality and relationship to the spiritual. Now, I think that's an area that for many Western scholars would be an uncomfortable position to take, but not necessarily for the Indigenous scholar. So I think if we were looking at qualitative methodology texts now, particularly Denson et al. In their last few editions, they've acknowledged the place of critical Indigenous knowledge, and many of those are auto-ethnographies. There is also a textbook by Indigenous scholars called the Routledge Handbook of Critical Indigenous Studies, and if you look at that, you'll find that there are many auto-ethnographies and as ways of generating Indigenous critical knowledge on their post-colonial state. So these are about Indigenous ways of knowing, doing and being. So we might say that auto-ethnography allowed a shift in ontology, epistemology and axiology on what is known, how it is known and what to do with it for the exotic other who now becomes the very central subject of the study. Thank you.